people. Okay. All right. Well, we'll keep charging on. If you have questions as I'm going, don't hesitate to holler and ask, and I'll be able to do that. Zoomers, you can do that too. I've had a couple people ask questions, so you're welcome to do that. I may not respond immediately. I may think I have voices in my head, but medication helps that, but won't help the Zoomers. So, okay, let me pray real quick, and then we'll get going. Father, thank you for this time. We give it over to your Holy Spirit just to reveal and show and poke at things that perhaps we've done a lot of effort, or made a lot of effort at creating walls around. And I pray that you'll allow us the opportunity to open those up and look at them, trusting your heart for us, even though it may be uncomfortable, and also continuing to learn a little bit more about what grace actually is and means in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so where I left off, I think, like I said, this was at the backside of on the backside of the videos that we were seeing. Suddenly this stops working. There it is. And the thing that I would remark, and I said this, actually some of the conversation that we had last week was somewhat of an inspiration for the podcast that I ended up doing on Saturday. And that, and the thing that I commented on that as I was talking about grace and shame and how it operates is that the voice of shame is the voice of transaction, and the voice of grace has the language of freedom. And so we looked at these three scenes from Les Mis, and the thing that I would point to in terms of understanding what is grace, I mentioned to you as well that I'm not really making any effort to look at it theologically. I just want to look at it in terms of what it does for us and how it challenges us to live lives differently. And so the thing that goes with this is the how do we actually experience it, and freedom and learning a new response and learning more about ourselves. The thing that I would add to this is, in next week, I believe, is that right? Yeah. Well, actually, the week after next is when we're going to start up groups. And I think the challenge you face with groups is, not only the fear that they bring, but also the wrestling that we do. Right? And we don't do this wrestling because we live our lives in these nice, compact little boxes, and we never kind of wander outside of there. And then you're forced into that, and then fear comes up, and then fear prompts us to run and deal with it very differently. So learning a new response, there's a lot I've been reading, certainly in a lot of the journals I've been reading, that it's been people's hopes that they learn a new way of doing things. And ultimately it always takes, as you've no doubt heard, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step, and that's usually the case when we're talking about these groups. So how do we experience group? We experience it as a pardon. It is ultimately the answer to guilt. And then we experience it as acceptance, which is the key word that we're talking about in grace, and our willingness to accept ourselves as we are, just as God does, and that's really ultimately the answer to shame. And then I think we begin to talk about it in terms of power. Is this the one I ended on? Or did we get further than this one?
This is new.
Say what?
This is new.
Oh, okay. And in some respects, when you hear, give me the grace to accomplish some end or to face some adversity or whatever it might be. It's asking for the power to do it, to accomplish it. And ultimately, the bigger issue is the power to move toward and embrace and know my true self. And of course, when you hear that word, you have to ask the question, so what is my true self? How do I know what it is? How do I nail it down? Whatever the phrase is you want to use it. And that's really what a course like this, a discussion like this is really all about. Is we already make preconceived assumptions about our true self. And so because of that, then we hide it from other people, because if they knew it the way we know it, of course, then they would conclude just like we do. So it creates this power. There's a really very telling scene. And it's one of the last scenes, actually, in the movie Braveheart. And Mel Gibson is portraying the life and times of William Wallace in Scotland. And they come in to actually, the Princess of England, who was romantically involved with him, came in and wanted to give him something to dull the pain. And he wanted to go through whatever he was going to go through, which he pretty much knew what it was going to look like, which was basically ultimately being drawn and quartered and sent to all four corners of the English Empire and beheaded. And after the scene, she gives him this elixir, and she leaves and he spits it out and basically says, God, give me the grace to face the adversity I'm going to face. And that's the use of the word grace, is the power to accomplish some things. And then the idea of gratitude, in a sense, we engage with the gift that it is. And if we don't understand what we're looking for and we don't engage it in our own lives, it's going to be really hard to see it in life in general. The gift that it represents and how lavish it is. We would never lavish anything on ourselves at the level God has with grace. And that's why we don't believe it. You know, we can say this is a gift way too good to be true. Yep, it is. So I have two choices: either accept it as the gift that's too good to be true, or diminish it so it's a gift that I can manage to accept. And that leads us back to this conversation around Reformation that I was talking about versus transformation. So grace in everyday life, grace in growth. We absolutely need grace to grow. It is an essential element to growth. And children are growing in the context of grace. Before they know anything else, they know love and grace, being loved by their parents, and ultimately the child's life is a life of grace. Because adults have to compensate. Rather than having expectations for the child that are similar to an adult, they have to compensate to meet the child where they are. Which I think gives us some insight into why God and Jesus' concepts about God and Abba and a child and the child's faith is used so often. Because somewhere along the line in our development, we come to a place that reminds us or shows us that there is no grace, therefore live by the law that you're given. The demands, the laws, the perfectionism that goes along with it. So grace offers us the acceptance that we need in order to accomplish the growth that we're after. And inevitably, you know, over this summer, my grandson learned how to ride his bike. And the thing that I was watching his dad do, besides getting his daily workout, was he wasn't saying to make the adjustments that Grayson needed to make. All he was saying was, you can do it, keep doing it, keep going, you're gonna do it right, etc. Keep at it, adjust your wheels. He'd make some adjustments and things like that. But that's what grace offers us. I mean, essentially, we reject it when we reject ourselves and refuse to accept ourselves, because we honestly think the lack of acceptance will motivate me to find acceptance through performance. So grace is this idea of a crockpot growth. It takes time, and it's not a microwave product. Shame, like I've said to you before, shame really does produce change very, very quickly, because we will do anything in our power to avoid it. The problem is it's not really growth that we're talking about. It's just simply change. So the other thing is kind of what you guys are doing here, and that is the idea of grace and learning. Grace allows the space to be able to make mistakes that we do. I mean, how many of you in any exam that you've had or assignment you've done, and when your professor, including me, gives you feedback, you go to shame first and say, this makes me a bad student, I can't ever do anything right, will I ever be enough? So we always get back to that question. But grace allows the space to make mistakes. I think the biggest challenge that I've had over the years in giving feedback, whether that's in assignments or anything else, is because I've talked to people so long, I know usually where they're going to take it. And it's not rocket science. It's always about shame. And so there are lots of occasions in my feedback that I will make an effort to add qualifiers into it to remind the person not to go into shame, but to see it for what it is honest feedback. I had an interesting kind of interaction last night. Comes with staying up way too late. And on Friday night, I went with my son-in-laws to get a pizza and hang out and do whatever. And we were at a restaurant and put our name on the list, told it was 25 minutes, and 45 minutes passed, and I went up and said, "What's the deal? What's going on?" And they looked, "What's your name?" And they look on the list, and we're already marked off. It's like, we're the only people out here, and we didn't really plan on eating on your sidewalk. And so there really wasn't any, I'm sorry, we should have done better, the usual restaurateur kind of things. It was, we'll get you a seat as soon as possible, and they got us seated and everything was good. Well, last night I ended up, which is I was not expecting at all, was I got an email from the general manager of this restaurant because I left them feedback about it. And all my feedback was generally good except for that one thing. And the remarkable thing about it was he was extremely gracious about his front staff. They're still learning, they're still trying to get it right. We're going to have some other teaching things we have to do. And my response back was, one, how much I appreciated the response back. He didn't have to do that. He could have just left it and moved on. And two, my effort wasn't to try to shame the restaurant into doing anything for me. All of my kids have been in the food service industry, whether it's Starbucks or other places. I know the pressure that they're under, particularly on a Friday night. And so I said, look, it's not about that at all. I don't need coupons. I'll take them. I don't need coupons. But this is the feedback, and I didn't really expect to hear back from him. But see, we can seed language. We can seed it with grace by how we respond back to people, and we add grace into an environment of gracelessness all the time. Even how we respond back. It doesn't mean it's going to come back to us. That's not the point, really. So grace creates this space for me to try something new and maybe not get it right and keep going. The funny thing about Grayson when he was learning, he was so determined, and he'd crash and fall and tears, all of that usual stuff, but he'd get back on the bike and go again. And the thing about kids is they don't think about, well, how many times do I have to do this until I finally get it right? It doesn't even occur to them. It's like, I get on the bike, I do it again. Period. They're living in this ever-present now. Versus adults, for us, we say, well, if I fail here, now what? I'm going to fail all the way out. And now what does my effort end up looking like? It now is kind of tainted with the projection or even the prediction of failure. And how much effort can I actually engage in? It's kind of a wonderful aspect of childhood, because they're growing up soaked in grace, and they use it with themselves all the time. They don't condemn themselves a lot of times unless they've seen other people do it. So it's taking the time to make the failures and learning. If you look at any of your pencils, I bet they have one feature to them always: an eraser. Now, if I make the goal of my life to never use the eraser, which is kind of how we tend to live life. Erasers there recognizing that I'm going to make mistakes, and I actually have the ability to erase it. So, grace and forgiveness is another topic we have to talk about. We will get into it in a lot more detail. Again, it's something that you guys have heard me talk about and rail about and rant about for a few times before. But grace and forgiveness is clearly built on the expectation of human limitations, human weaknesses, making mistakes, not getting it right. That's what forgiveness is really all about. Forgiveness turned into retribution and shame doesn't result in deeper relationships, but forgiveness does. And ultimately, as I've said to you before, that my forgiveness that I offer someone else is commensurate with my understanding of my own level of forgivenness. So if I offer kind of the social convention forgiveness, it's okay, don't worry about it, then probably, generally, I don't really understand forgiveness very well for myself and my own forgiveness. Because it shows up. It shows up in our interactions with people and how we offer them. Now, the one thing that has to be said is, in a lot of cases, we offer people forgiveness that we don't even feel, which ends up creating a split. So I am one way in public, I'm in one way with people around me, but I'm a different way with myself in my head. And that's a whole other kind of thing underlying this forgiveness. So when we look at it, we realize grace is giving away what we couldn't afford to others who can't possibly repay it. It's the definition of grace. So we're giving away something we can't afford either, but we're passing it on to people that can't repay that. So Henry Nouwen defines forgiveness as love practiced among people who love poorly. Because we know we're going to make mistakes. There's got to be an out. There's got to be kind of the oil to our relationship, and that's what forgiveness is. It's the oil that keeps the engine running. It seizes up when I say, nope, I'm not until you do whatever. Apologize or recognize or make amends or whatever whatever the conditions are of the forgiveness, which isn't forgiveness at all, really. It's more of a trade. So, grace and forgiveness go together. A lot of people would say that forgiveness is grace in action and what it actually looks like. The other issue or the other aspect of this is grace and self-acceptance. Apparently there's a rumor running around that Jones and I are working on a book. Maybe Jones is. I don't know if I am. But we have had many discussions about the idea of self-acceptance. And is it scriptural? And when you look at Jesus saying to the people in the Sermon on the Mount and other places, love your neighbor as yourself, it implies that there's something about self-love that is biblical. It's not something that is anti-biblical at all. So there are three specific conditions to this: accepting the gift as it's given, and cultivating the humility and my sense of need. Now, we spent a little time talking about safe people and identifying needs and wrestling with, just because I have needs doesn't make me needy. And so I commit to learning all along the way rather than knowing, which is an end point. You know, whoever you are taught by, the hope would be is that they're always learning too. They share a small slice of what they have come to know, but they're always adding to it because that's a part of grace and self-acceptance. We bump into a rejection of ourselves when we think I have to arrive somewhere, rather than be on a journey to the ultimate destination, but be on the journey all the same. So the idea of self-acceptance oftentimes is a great intellectual concept, but it's far from one that we put into practice in any kind of realistic way or real way at all, okay? So there are a few of these dimensions that we're talking about. The other thing I want to mention to you, which you guys have heard me talk about many times before, is the idea of grace in the well. You know, we talked about this in I've talked about this in Boundaries. But when you have Proverbs 24:3, watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flows the springs of life. Now, what does grace and this idea of our well, our heart, how are they connected? And the way that they're connected is shame tempts us into the thought that we should go downstream and deal with all the trash that's down there. Because if I get that out of the way, then everything will be fine. On the other hand, grace says, no, let's go to the well. Let's see what's coming out of there and deal with the things that are at the heart of how I think. Because whatever is at the heart of what I think ends up with the trash downstream. Okay? And that's key to understand. And that's why grace and the well is so connected, because grace leads me into caring for that well in such a way that there's less and less trash coming out of it. Now that doesn't mean there are people, to use the metaphor, it's not like there aren't people that throw stuff into the river of my heart anyway. But if I'm going to live by grace and embrace this thing called self-acceptance, then I'm going to start at the well first. It will take longer. It will always take longer. It does take longer. Why? Because growth takes time. Change may or may not take that kind of time. So the well is key. Shame tempts us to pay all of our attention to downstream stuff. And I'll just give you one real easy example. When Jesus talks about in the Sermon on the Mount of how to handle lust, and basically he says about if you look at a woman lustfully in your heart, you've already committed adultery. Well, what's the downstream behavior? It's committing adultery. He says it's the core of the heart. So if I objectify somebody into an object for my use, what is going to be the downstream behavior? It's going to be using them that way. You see? So we get, I think generally speaking, and this is whatever. This is a commentary on the church. We tend to settle for downstream trash than the conditions of our well, and helping people understand what the well is really all about and how important it actually is. We don't equip people to be able to plumb the well and care for it and take care, and clean it out, if you will. And in a lot of cases, counseling is an attempt at that. But the reality is I can't do one or the other. I've got to do both. I've got to spend some time downstream clearing out all the trash that has fallen on other people because of my unwillingness to deal with the well, plus going back to the well and trying to figure out what is befouling this thing. And I'll read you a story next time to make that very point. So, Matthew 12, you brood of vipers, how can you who are evil say anything good? For out of the overflow of the heart the mouth speaks. The overflow of the heart the mouth speaks. What comes out of our mouth is downstream trash. It betrays the well, for out of the heart comes those things. And Jesus said it over and over again, really, about the idea that it's not what we put into our body that contaminates us. It's what's coming out of our heart that contaminates us. And we have to keep that clearly in mind. If I'm not armed with grace to adjust and to address that and move toward it, I'm always going to be dealing with downstream behavior. Here's another example. The good man brings good things out of the good treasure of his heart, and the evil man brings evil things out of the evil treasure of his heart. For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Same probably exactly the same situation Luke is quoting from as Matthew is. They heard the same things, so we tend to hear the same things. So why is it that grace is such an issue for us? That's the big key here. Why is it such an issue for us? Because you would think, given this kind of gift and the lavishness of this gift and the freedom that we're offered, and all that we're offered as far as acceptance, even though we're not acceptable, and the freedom to move into that, why do we reject it? Why do we diminish it? Maybe not reject it. I think intellectually we don't reject it. But emotionally, a lot of times we do. But why is it so difficult? And I've got a few ideas about that. The first one is this, is it violates our sense of justice and punishment. The reason that we struggle with grace is when somebody does something wrong, that somebody should be punished. And that's the law. That is our internal law as well as our external law. So it violates our sense of justice to be given a gift. I had somebody I was talking to on Friday, and we were talking about this very thing. And this person was convinced that that she was going to go to hell. And she said to me, you mean to tell me that God gives me grace and I just kind of walk scot-free into paradise? And I said, well, think about the thief on the cross with Jesus. It took 5 minutes of faith for him to meet Jesus in paradise that day. So yeah. And is it fair? No. Jesus told plenty of stories about the unfairness of the graciousness of the landowner. Remember all the people, he would go out to the square and he'd get some at noon and some at 3 and some at 6. And by the time the end of the day came around, he paid them all the same amount of money. And the people that were there at 9 o'clock in the morning or noon were really upset. And it's like, don't I have a right to give out of my riches to anyone I want? That's kind of what grace is like. So it violates our sense of justice that we've all grown up with. We've all grown up with it. And so the idea of punishment evens the tables out. And so we end up in this pattern over and over again of retribution with ourselves. And even in the extreme with self-harm, that shows up that way as well. Not to mention kind of triggering some kind of feelings at all. The second thing is it's free, and we don't like that either. We don't like being indebted even to God. It costs the receiver nothing and the giver everything, literally. And so we fall into this pattern, even with grace, that says, no, I've got to do something to be able to prove that I'm worthy of it when the giver has already pronounced us worthy. So the other one is just simply being a gift. And again, this is all language I'm sure you've all used. But when a gift is given, it communicates to the person their worth and value to the giver. That's what gifts are for. So this particular gift of grace that we're given is meant to reestablish the Imago Dei in us. Because we were meant for freedom. We were meant for intimacy with God and each other. We were meant for all of those things. And then sin entered into the world and contaminated all that. And we branch out into controlling one another rather than the intimacy that we were invited into originally. So grace is this gift that allows us to reestablish our sense of value and worth in God and being the image bearers that God intended us to be, not image makers. Because we tend to get into the image making thing, and so it offers dignity to all of us as a result. The thing is that a lot of our internal conversations and narratives are about denigrating our value and worth and then linking it to some kind of performance. Because if I link it to a performance, then I know its value. But the idea of having value in and of ourselves, inherent value, is, from a Christian point of view, it's so, I got it. But I don't live that way at all. I don't live that way at all. So there's a portion of that we have to grapple with in terms of how we live, not what we say, because there's a difference between those things. There's another thing about this that we don't like, and that is it's not a quid pro quo. You all know what I mean when I say quid pro quo. It's this for that. I will give you this performance for that value that you accord to me. The heart of shame is about contracts and quotas and doing just enough and trading for this, for that. The heart of grace is covenant, not a contract. And ultimately, even as Christians, I'm not sure we really understand what covenant means. Because we just transliterate it into a contract. I do certain things for you, you do certain things for me. We call it good. As long as that balance table stays even, we're good. The remarkable thing about covenant is that God covenanted with Abram, and Abram was completely unable to respond back because he had nothing to give God in return. So God bound himself to Abram even when Abram couldn't complete the deal, so to speak. So really, we see something like this where there's no quid pro quo, it's free, it's a gift, and all these things. And what do we say? Well, where's the loophole here? Something this good, there's got to be something, strings attached, something connected to it. And really, the only catch, if you want to put it that way, to grace is the openness to receive it. And that's what we all struggle with. That's what we all struggle with. Listen to any of our conversations, even the conversation when I was setting the computer up, or the narrative going in my head about what you guys are thinking and how long it takes me to get all this crap set up. It's not your voices. I'm not taking a poll from any one of you about what you're thinking. I'm doing your thinking for them. Better yet, I'm doing your speaking for you too. You're welcome. Because if I actually asked, I probably would be told, don't sweat it. It's part of the deal. But then it's like, wait, it can't be that good. What's the catch? Got to have a better lecture as a result. See, we lapse into trades all the time. So the only catch here is really having the heart to accept it and move toward it. So the other thing that we've mentioned already is just how scandalous it actually is. It's coming to us free of charge, no strings attached, And it seems to go against every instinct we have as humans in terms of transactional economies. And the one thing that makes Christianity, because details matter, makes Christianity absolutely remarkable, is that God's love is unconditional and His grace is free. You will not find that in any other religion. There's always a trade. So throughout the Bible, God shows this marked preference for real people over good people. And all you have to do is follow Jesus' ministry and the rabble that followed behind him, sinners and tax collectors. But they knew what they didn't have, and they knew what they needed. The Pharisees and Sadducees thought they knew all there was to know, remember learning and knowing, and therefore then attacked the man that was saying, follow me. Let's go on a journey by implication. So it's scandalous. That's why the cornerstone that became the stumbling block, otherwise known as the scandalon in Greek culture, was the very thing that led to the nature of what we see here and what we see with grace. So grace becomes uncomfortable. It becomes an issue for us because it doesn't conform to our view of the world and how the world works. The reality is the world around us doesn't work this way. It doesn't. We all know that. We shift into gears and know that there's trades waiting for us everywhere, and people's approval is conditioned on what I do and what I say and how I look and how many friends I have or whatever that might be. It's always built on those things. But in this world of what God offers us in terms of grace, it's almost as if we prefer ourselves to the free running out on the field of grace. We'd rather count the bricks in the cell and know them all by heart than to spend time out in the freedom of what trust brings us and everything that goes with it. So the first thing is the scandal of grace. The second thing is the comfort of shame. So these are complementary things. These are the coin, if you will, of the realm is what kind of relationship am I going to have? One that is built on grace or one that is built on shame? Like I said, oftentimes we prefer our jail cell that we know all too well. We have the walls very clearly marked out. We know the expectations of the people in there. We don't have to worry about that. It's never going to change, versus the wild and furious longing of God and love of God for us, like G.K. Chesterton said, which scares us. It really does. So shame becomes this comfort to us. And I want to try to unpack a little bit of this as we go along here. So where does it get its power from? Now I'm weaving in and out of the material that you have read already in Brené Brown. But where does it get its power from in this context? And that's why I want to connect it up with the idea of comfort. It's connected to our identity. That's why it's so threatening to us. Because it threatens the connection and the acceptance that is offered to us in a gracious relationships. And when it threatens it, it doesn't do it, but it threatens it. And that's enough for us to succumb or to acquiesce or to bow to this thing. The thing we have to be mindful of is shame does change other people's behavior, and we can use it. Usually the tool of shame is control. We can use it to change people's behavior and to protect ourselves. And that's the thing. Don't miss what I just said. Shame is the condition. The tool is control. You sit down in the group for the first time and eyeball each other, and you will already be making calculations about sizing people up and what you know or don't know of them, and what risks you're willing to take. And shame has entered the conversation already at that point. The third thing is it threatens our sense of belonging. Our belonging is that sense of connection that Brene Brown talks about. And so we run the risk of feeling alone and cast out and ostracized. And we are being rejected. We are rejected for our being, who we are, rather than our behavior. And that's what makes shame so powerful. But the rules of engagement are always the same, and that predictability oftentimes is chosen over the relationship of trust and grace. The rules of engagement are built on trust in grace. But the rules of engagement in shame never change, and they're always articulated. Everybody knows the drill, everybody knows the dance, they know how to do that dance, and they will do it regularly throughout. So the threat that it has in terms of our identity, the way that we use it to change other people's behavior, and then how it threatens just our sense of belonging. The one thing that I have said many times before is that in order to describe something, in order to understand it in any way, we have to have a language to do that. In counseling, we have language there to describe things. In a lot of cases, I honestly, and I say this really very honestly, I don't think what I do is really all that remarkable. All I'm doing is giving words to things that people are already feeling. That's really all I do. And then they can start to build. So we really lack the vocabulary to understand shame and how it operates in our lives. Without the words to describe it, we really can't do much about it or develop some kind of strategy. And we can't respond to it. One of the things no doubt you are probably already beginning to feel, having read through a lot of Daring Greatly, having read and heard me talk about this for the last 3 weeks, is suddenly the world is littered with shame. You see it everywhere, not only in your own head, but everywhere around in your relationships. And the worst part about it is you see it, and where does it take us? More shame. We don't have a real creative toolkit. We only have one thing, and that is this weapon of shame that we use against ourselves. And that's inevitable, because we're starting to build a vocabulary around grace and shame, and how do we understand it? Because in most cases, most people would say, I didn't know that was shame. So we only experience it, but we don't label it. And see, the challenge, one of the reasons, and you guys know this because you've been in my classes before, one of the reasons I have you doing journals is to do the self-reflection and label your experience, not for me, for yourselves. Because then you can know the landscape of your own heart. There's no way to do that if you don't wander it and label it. If I just wander it and not say anything about what it could be or where it came from or the nature of what the relationships are, what's going to change? And that's not being critical or judgmental or anything. It's just being descriptive, which is very much a part of the conversations that we end up having to have in terms of this, how this works. So what is it? Again, these are definitions you've seen before. From Dr. Brown. Yes, Ed?
Do you think it can be harmful for people to label guilt as shame?
Yeah, and that's kind of why I'm differentiating them, because I think for most Christians, they think those are exactly the same. And so, yeah, absolutely, they could. It is, and that's, even modern psychology has done that, is guilt is shame, and therefore it's to be avoided at all costs and all of that kind of thing. So I think the one service Brene Brown has done for us is actually differentiated these things for us. Now, she doesn't do it in a Christian context, but still, I think it's every bit as valid to understand it. So yeah, I can. Absolutely, I can. We're mislabeling things and then reacting to something like guilt. I'm not living up to the standard I have for myself or that God sets for me, and I feel guilty. Okay, that's good. Why? Because it prompts me to change. But if I add shame to that picture, then I won't change because now I'm a bad person. So yeah, she makes this distinction. Shame is this intensely painful feeling or experience of believing we are flawed and therefore unworthy of acceptance and belonging. And that's Brown's definition. These characteristics that she mentions of embarrassment and guilt and humiliation and shame are all very much different. And I'm not sure we differentiate these very much. It's just one big ball of kind of all of this stuff together, and all we really fundamentally do is just try to run from it as much as we can. By not labeling it, we just scream and so forth. So embarrassment is doing something that's fleeting, that's temporary. I may look back on it and laugh a little bit at myself about it. Of course, if you add shame into it, all of these things start being pretty devastating. But embarrassment is pretty normal. It oftentimes ends up being humorous to us. I did that yesterday. You guys know what I mean by pampas grass? Has anybody ever heard that before? These really 12 feet, 14-foot grasses that have a top knot on it. It looks like wheat. And we have one of those in our backyard, and it's been, since the snowstorm, it's been kind of bowing to me. I swear that it is. But suddenly it's starting to get higher and higher, and I made the brilliant move of hitting it. And so all the seeds keep flying down on my face, and I'm sneezing for the rest of the afternoon. And I walk in, and my wife says, "Well, that was brilliant." I said, "Thanks. I was trying to be dumb." And it's funny. It's kind of like, duh, you have a PhD. I can figure these things out. So the other thing that we have to talk about then is, with these four, is guilt and shame are both based on self-evaluation. Both of them are. But guilt is connected to something, I did something bad. I did something bad. And shame is connected to I am bad. And see how simple these little phrases are, and guess where they come from? Where we learn in childhood. I mean, we carry these simple declarative statements with us. And they come from when we're growing up, that somehow we make this conclusion, if I do something bad, then I am bad. And that's kind of built on the backdrop of all of the things that we're talking about here. Like I said, with guilt and shame, it's always about looking at ourselves, the self-evaluation we make around these things and all that goes with it. I have gotten to the point now, after talking to people for as long as I have, that I can detect phrases that we use that have the shame in it. I am bad underneath it. Now, it's not said, but if I pay attention to how the person is talking about it, oftentimes I will see that it's not just guilt. It really is shame. It's like I'm feeling like I'm less of a human because I've done it this way. So a couple other things from this list. Guilt is comparing our actions against some ethics, values, and beliefs. In Christian terms, this would be captured by the word that we use in conviction. Being convicted by the Holy Spirit is usually the phrase that we use. So I'd refer you back. You guys have heard me talk about this before, 2 Corinthians 7. When Paul talks about worldly sorrow versus godly sorrow leading us to repentance, worldly sorrow leading us to death. Not physical death, but death of relationships and my ability to respond to other people, all of those things. And that's a distinction that Brene Brown doesn't talk about as much. because she's not coming from that perspective per se. I think she certainly is a person who has religious or Christian sensibilities in what she's writing and talking about. But we would probably use the word conviction instead. Yes, Ed?
Do you think guilt is always a result of conviction in the Holy Spirit?
I mean, I think it gets a little confused because our excessively high standards for ourselves, we might respond with guilt because we didn't measure up to those standards, but we don't ever evaluate whether or not the standards are even realistic or not. So I think generally speaking, and one very old, he's been around a long time, long dead now, but Paul Tournier, and he makes this distinction between moral guilt and false guilt. So he kind of separates them out, and moral guilt being about the not living up to the standards that God sets for us and the ethics that flow out of His Word and so forth. The false guilt is, I don't measure up to other people's expectations. And so we feel it the same, okay? The way we experience guilt is exactly the same between false and moral guilt. But there's something very different about it, and I think it comes back to kind of our connectedness to people and how threatened we can become as a result of that. So the other part of this is, is somewhat repetitive, but I'll say it anyway. Shame's about our person, and it can't be adjusted or changed very easily, partly because it's connected to our person. And the name of the game, I don't really mean for this to rhyme, but I'll say it anyway. The name of the game in shame is comparison. It's always comparison. And we never compare to somebody lesser than us, ever. Even if we idealize the other person. But it's comparing ourselves against this mythical standard or ideal standard of personhood. And this is where perfectionism often comes in. So we are far more likely to engage in self-destructive behaviors, whatever they might be, in response to shame than grace. Grace is such an unknown to us that we really haven't gotten comfortable with it at all. So, when we start to question our own value or worth as a person, then what we end up doing is, subjugating ourselves to others, and what comes out of that is silencing ourselves and then blaming the other person for silencing us because of their expectations or whatever that might be. And they're not, but it's my expectations and my expectations that I've now projected onto somebody else, and then I silence myself because I don't want to look foolish, or I don't want to feel the humiliation we were talking about earlier, or any of those other things, or just a larger picture of shame that is equally part of that. So the shame is always about our person, not our performance. That's an easy way to remember it. It's about being exposed and not being able to protect ourselves. And that really is kind of the last item. I know a lot of you guys are still writing. I'll put these slides up so you can get at them. But we don't like being exposed. Now, we accord other people a lot more power than they have to expose us. So we do everything we can to make sure that we're not put in a position that we can't protect ourselves. And because within that is really kind of the nature of what we experience through shame. So shame's about our person, it's about exposure, it's about being ostracized and feeling like the outsider. And at various points in time, in various groups of people that we've been a part of, we feel this. We feel like we have been on the outside looking in, and that's part of this being ostracized. That is a part of it. I'm hearing all this echo.
Yeah, you're muted.
I am muted? Oh.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Hopefully you hear me now.
I don't know.
Verizon commercial. Okay, it's about self-loathing and understand why people hate you. And again, there's a lot of internal narrative that we're playing with here. And that internal narrative now is kind of placed into another person, and then we react as if that they are actually thinking those things and what goes into it. So our self-loathing now becomes the loathing of other people toward us. And that really actually it makes us reactive. Because if I'm already thinking poorly of myself and then I sense somebody else doing that with me, then I will pick it up very, very quickly. And I've seen that in innumerable situations. And you really can't point it out because the person is not all that aware of their self-condemnation and self-loathing. So you point it out and guess where they go? More self-loathing. But it makes them susceptible then to other people's negative emotions, or at least perceived negative emotions, that adds to this further sense of self-loathing that they feel. So, all right, I'm not going to go much further. Let me stop for a second, see what questions you have, how this is striking you, any reactions you have to it, anything at all. No. Okay, well, we will let you chew on that for a couple of days, and we will see you Wednesday and get farther down this road of talking about shame. See you, Zoom folks. Thanks for your patience.